How many of you have had the demoralizing experience of being labeled a troublemaker as soon as you question or raise an objection to a policy, regulation, proposal, or teaching method? Quite a few of you, I see. Okay. Well, being seen as uncooperative is a no-no, as you've probably figured out. Sometimes you may even wind up in an out-and-out confrontation when all you meant to do was inject a different viewpoint. Unfortunately, most laypersons, and sometimes even legislators, don't realize they're dealing with well-trained provocateurs the minute they set foot in a room with folks who are chairing a meeting. These chairpersons may pretend to be just facilitators and moderators of a discussion, but they're not. To have your view heard and taken seriously, you must know first how to recognize psychological manipulation and work around it. You need to take the debate away from your adversary and argue the question on your terms, not on your opponent's terms. To do this requires that you master certain principles of argument and be able to apply them in a group setting and under pressure. For reasons you'll understand shortly, it's easier to control a group than a single individual. Now, that may seem strange, but it's actually the reason behind attempts to collectivize people, suppress their individuality, as per Michael Shaw's comment earlier on. Unethical facilitators, like the ones with an ulterior motive, will try to maneuver you first into a group setting, and that's your first giveaway that you're dealing with a pro. Or as I'll be using the term here, a provocateur, a change agent, an agitator, but basically a provocateur. The group is used by this provocateur to help combat any potential adversary by isolating you, ridiculing you, ostracizing you, and finally overwhelming you. Attorneys, media commentators, and journalists are among the few who get the training that I'm going to give you. Most of us are caught up in the idea that there's always strength in numbers and that that's the best way to get through to an adversary via a one-on-one discussion. Both are true only if people are honestly debating the issue as equals. But it's not true if the debate is dishonest. If a provocateur can generate a mob mentality and get it to work for him, well, he has control of the agenda. And that's rule number 2. Never let the other fellow conduct the agenda and control the agenda. And by the way, that's how your kids get caught up in all sorts of nastiness, from falling for the hype over trashy artists like Eminem to competing to look like hookers and pimps in school. The teacher, who nowadays functions as an agent of change before all else, deliberately heightens peer pressure so that it functions as a mob mentality. Once that occurs, ideas can be planted that go against 2,000 years of civilization. Both children and adults will accept them for no other reason than that it's fashionable. Of course, children are typically undiscerning and have no experience with hardcore manipulation tactics. Too many parents today have been convinced by experts that authoritarianism and individualism are bad. After nearly 45 years of this nonsense, most of us are ill-equipped to stand up for our principles, much less teach our kids how to do so. We fear being censured and insulted. When we feel cornered, we may sound hysterical, raise our voices, and ensure our doom. The key to remember is that the provocateur gets the group to do the dirty work for him. The mob mentality is achieved by creating what is known in the vernacular of experts as a psychologically controlled environment. You will want to disrupt, or better yet, preempt the establishment of a psychologically controlled environment. Failing that, you'll need to understand the strategies and techniques that a provocateur uses to assure the outcome he or she wants, so that you can counter these techniques as you go and get others in the group to help you, whether they understand what you're doing or not. In other words, you have to beat the provocateur at his or her own game. So, the first principles you need to be clear about to mount an effective campaign that will neutralize the provocateurs' consensus-building strategies are: it's easier to control a group than to control a single individual. Never let the other fellow control the debate or agenda. And watch out for the psychologically controlled environment. These are the core principles of controlling a discussion. The rest of the principles we will take up may appear at first glance to apply only to physical wars, but they're key to any kind of battle, including psychological warfare. Let's examine some of the strategic principles from an ancient Chinese text, The Art of War, thought to have been written about 476 BC. This little book has received renewed attention since 9/11, but few recognize it as the principles of psych war. An army cannot be run according to the rules of etiquette. Those skilled in war subdue the enemy without battle. Deception and surprise are two key principles of battle. The enemy's leaders must be confused, if possible, driven insane. That's actually how he said it, Sun Tzu, way back in 476 BC. From just these four principles, you can see that demoralization of the enemy was a high priority even back then. Our opponents today have used these four strategies against the populace with tremendous success. The first task, then, of professional agitation is to create the psychologically controlled environment. This makes it easier for one side to frame the debate and to keep the opposition, that's you, from doing so. A psychologically controlled environment provides a platform from which to operate and prevents people like you from injecting another viewpoint or, worse yet, redirecting the discussion. The consensus generated from such a forum typically is taken to your legislators and presented as what the community really wants. This sets up a kind of mass neurosis because people like you know the consensus isn't true. Yet the lie is presented by reputable sources that are believed. This leads to a psychological condition known as cognitive dissonance, meaning an irreconcilable conflict has been set up. As people become uncomfortable, you see, they vacillate. They lose their frame of reference, become alienated. An alienated electorate, particularly if it's the backbone of a community, helps the provocateur because it effectively gets the primary resistance out of the way. Another take on this game, if you will, has been for the provocateur to whip dissenters into a teeth-clenching frenzy of anger until they become so outraged, enraged, and frustrated that they start lashing out in all directions, unfocused, and in disarray. Understand that the counterculture activists, the folks we're dealing with, are not interested in any exchange of ideas. They aren't writing well-considered philosophical discourses to each other like the Founding Fathers did. They want to drive the opposition insane. In other words, cause them to act irrationally. You know, get so mad that we sputter over our words, slam the door, and just lose it, okay? So, the hypocritical way in which rules are applied to those with politically incorrect views and the disparity in your treatment by the press, all this is deliberately calculated to drive us crazy. As the frustration is turned up, eventually someone, somewhere, will go off the deep end. A bomb explodes at an abortion clinic. A survivalist holes up in some secluded area and starts shooting the trespassers. This thrills our adversaries no end, because then they can come along and say that all people who oppose abortion or all people who want to be left alone are dangerous. Which brings us back to the beginning. It's bad form to object. No wonder we're getting clobbered. Now, remember, this is a crash course. Professional agitators spend weeks, months, or years perfecting the techniques I'm going to show you. So if you have a manual already, I'll be skipping around in there because this is normally a 5 to 8 hour course with self-test materials and advanced strategies for folks running for public office in there too. You'll need to go home, memorize the various principles we're going to go over, get with somebody and practice the techniques I'll be explaining here. Throwing hardball tactics back in the face of a professional provocateur is risky business unless you have practiced. You may learn how to do it theoretically, but without practice you're likely to modify the techniques just enough so that you botch them under pressure. Too much or too little emphasis on certain words, a telling facial expression, sitting with each other during a meeting, all of these things can give away your hand, which you don't want to do. So with these caveats in mind, let's just move along. One problem is that most of us don't think like direct marketing agents. We've heard about marketing packages. Well, that's the thing here. Our adversaries do think like direct marketing agents. We care about integrity. That is, the end doesn't always justify the means. The opposition doesn't. We worry that others might get hurt if we speak out. The education establishment, for example, doesn't give one hoot who gets hurt in the process. Whether it's magazines, billboards, brochures, newspaper columns, speeches, press conferences, grant proposals, psychological impact is paramount to our opposition. Not the facts, not anybody's precious principles, and certainly not right or wrong. If you've read my book, Cloning of the American Mind, you're somewhat familiar with rigged consensus building. But for those who aren't, a little background is in order. The dictionary definition of a consensus is group solidarity in sentiment and belief and/or general agreement. Unanimity, on the other hand, is defined as collective opinion. Increasingly, people are hearing the term consensus, when what our opponents want in reality is unanimity or uniform thinking. All consensus building is based upon one of the principles of the German philosopher Hegel from 1770 to 1831. In plain English, this principle states that you could take one firm view and its opposite, combine them, and come up with a brand new viewpoint, which will be a synthesis of the two. This new viewpoint will be one that all parties supposedly will accept. So, a consensus is generally or essentially a collective opinion that doesn't reflect anyone's opinion. Okay? When the collective good is viewed as superior to or more important than the individual good as per the socialist globalist view, then consensus no longer falls into the category of a compromise. Consensus is a stronger term because the pro and con viewpoints in the collectivist mindset no longer exist. The rightness or wrongness of the original viewpoints are not at issue. The point is to produce a new ideal, opinion, or value that will be universally supported, or at least appear to be supported by everyone. And that's the rub. Appears to be. The purpose of the various consensus strategies is to preserve the illusion that there is lay or community participation in policy-related decision-making when in fact there isn't. That means something far different from working out a compromise. When a professional provocateur is trying to gain acceptance of, say, a gay lesbian club at your local high school, they know they have to at least pretend to involve the community in that decision and have something to that effect in writing when people complain to their legislators in Congress. The Delphi technique is just one unethical method of achieving consensus on controversial topics. A well-trained professional agitator is deliberately escalating tensions all the time among group members, pitting one faction against the other to make one side appear ridiculous and the other side sensible. The setting or type of group in which the technique is used is immaterial. The logic behind its success is that most groups tend to share a particular knowledge base and display a finite set of identifiable characteristics. What the provocateur must do is locate those smaller factions within the larger group. Provocateurs often call themselves facilitators because that sounds neutral. But what these pros really do is work the group over and ensure a predetermined outcome. what they call a consensus. If the discussion is facilitated properly, all participants will emerge believing that the decision was reached was their own idea. Only later, sometimes only an hour later, will they realize they've been duped. Donning his or her facilitator hat, the provocateur encourages each person in a group to express concerns about a program, project, or policy. She listens attentively, elicits input from group members, forms task forces, urges participants to make lists. And in going through all this talk and motions, she learns something about each member of the group. She's looking for each raised eyebrow. She's looking at your body language. The agitator-facilitator is trained to identify the leaders, the loudmouths, the weak or non-committal members, and those who are apt to change ideas during an argument, change their sides. The provocateur first will try to become an accepted member of your group. Then later will turn the factions of the group against its own members. Suddenly the amiable facilitator will become devil's advocate. Using the divide and conquer principle, she pits one faction against the other, and those views that are not desired will suddenly appear ridiculous, unknowledgeable, inarticulate, or dogmatic. She deftly augments tensions, deliberately escalates disagreements. If the stage was set properly during the list-building phase, a well-trained provocateur will be able to really get most members of the group right where they want them. Individuals in opposition to a desired policy will find themselves shut out. The Delphi technique works, folks. It's effective with parents, teachers, school children, and community groups. The targets rarely, if ever, notice that they're being manipulated. If they do suspect what's happening, they generally don't know how to shut the process down. Suppose a desired policy is no failing grades, and suppose that policy is placed on the table. The provocateur utilizes a selective hearing process so that only those questions that support no failing grades will be placed on the table for discussion. The only opposing arguments permitted will be those that the provocateur deems helpful in escalating tensions later on. So, if you have an opposing view and you know that's not the preferred view, don't be taken in by the fact that this so-called facilitator acknowledges your suggestion. Remain on your guard. The provocateur, acting as moderator, guides the discussion so that it doesn't get away from him or her. This means that the facilitator operative frames the debate and is careful not to let go. Soon some participants begin to adopt the no failing grades idea as if it were their own, and will be manipulated into pressuring the entire group into accepting that proposition. Basically, the consensus strategies like Delphi are based on Marx's theory of alienation, which states that folks will do just about anything to avoid being ostracized, ridiculed, or to otherwise lose face. What happens is that somewhere in the consensus building process there's a switch that confuses, numbs, and freezes normal responses. Aware that something's going wrong but unable to explain or define it, you find yourself tongue-tied. Linguistics professor Dean Gocher, director of the Institute of Authority Research, explains that there appears to be a trigger mechanism that cuts off awareness of impending danger and suppresses the ability to resist, resulting in indecision and eventually capitulation. Between the computer and word of mouth, it's fairly easy for a provocateur to pre-select individuals who are likely to go along with a proposal and thus to pack an audience. Participants against a facilitator-desired proposal are frequently included too, but they're screened in order to ensure they will not be particularly articulate, or that they will sound shrill in their voice, or hysterical, or that they have a reputation for being unorganized in their presentations. So I hate to say this, but don't be overly flattered if you're asked to serve on a curriculum committee or a task force. The key to resistance, especially in highly charged, well-organized situations, lies in controlling the environment of thought. An environment of thought means determining what a group of individuals is going to think about and for how long. For example, the media has decided that the Michael Jackson fiasco is a hot topic and that it can be made to divert attention from more important subjects. Whoever controls the debate or agenda controls the substance of what's going on, be it a discussion, political issues to be addressed, what news is read on the air and what news is spiked, even what music goes out over the airwaves and what gets no airtime at all. If such control is engineered by an experienced professional in a group setting, a meeting, a focus group, a committee, task force, and so on, no questions will be asked, no views will be aired that deviate from the pre-selected topics. Another tool in the arsenal of pros is the ability to make facts and truths interchangeable. Now think about that. What's the difference between a fact and a truth? Making truths and facts interchangeable involves easing individuals away from thinking about how they personally feel on a topic in the context of their own experience. This is accomplished by placing members of the group into a hypothetical environment, a pretend situation that's essentially foreign to their experience but which requires their involvement. That is, placing you into a what would you do if situation. And by the way, this is why school tests and questionnaires pose hypothetical what would you do if questions, to place the students in an environment that's essentially foreign to their experience, but which requires their involvement to pass the test. Done correctly, each individual in the group, or in the case of a pupil questionnaire, each child will move from traditional or fixed beliefs to a transitional mode of thought in which facts become murky and truth and principle are in conflict. From there, the various views held by the majority can be reworded by the facilitator or teacher for the supposed benefit of the group, until opinions a person walked in the door with will become watered down, distorted, and ill-defined. So the facilitator is basically there to sell you something you don't need in the form of a program, a curriculum, an activity, a viewpoint, a proposal, or a process. They are not there to help the community, school, student, or group decide what to do. They're there to help you do what they, or more likely, their employers want you to do. To accomplish that, the professional will attempt to trick the group into believing that the program, curriculum, or activity or process was your idea. From there, the group will be manipulated so that folks who are still saying to themselves subconsciously, wait a minute, this isn't my idea, are either convinced to change sides or are overwhelmed by the other members of the group. Your job is to force the facilitator, the provocateur, to expose his or her agenda as early on as possible before he gets you to define yours. Okay, so what do we have to do to counteract somebody else's psychological environment? First, we have to determine what the real issue is. You may, for example, find advertised ahead of time some theme for a meeting, which later turns out to be quite different from what you thought it was going to be. Once you get there, everyone will be encouraged to make lists and talk and so on, because then you can't think straight. The goal is to feel out the group, get a handle on where everyone's coming from. So the thing to do is stay quiet for a while. Thus, rule number 2, don't give the provocateur anything to work with until you know why you're there. After you've determined the real issue and committed to keeping yourself quiet, you ask, what is my basic position on this issue? Remember it, and that's rule number 3, establishing your thesis or your real opinion and not to let go of it. Other people, of course, will have the opposite view. Remember, what the provocateur wants is a synthesis of 2 opposing positions, which will be termed a compromise, but it won't be. It will be whatever position the provocateur's boss wants it to be. Okay, let's take a proposal to get to sex education, a program for sex education implemented into first grade. What's the first thing you do, people? What's the first thing you do? You determine the issue. Will the issue, the group's reason for meeting, be worded as a new sex education program? No, probably not. They won't tell you that. It will be presented as the problem of AIDS or teen pregnancy or youngster sexual activity. This is what is meant by use of deception. Nobody actually lies, they just withhold the truth and allow you to make mistaken assumptions. So before you go to a meeting, find out who the presenters are going to be. Who are the vested interests? That is, who stands to benefit financially from this meeting? Is it the World Resources Institute, the Environmental Defense Fund, the Sierra Club, the World Wildlife Fund? Who? Is there a specific program they may be trying to sell you? Now, the school district, in this case, on the sex education program, may come up with an abstinence program. So you don't want to jump to conclusions, but even if that is on the table, you can be relatively sure that the audience is packed, perhaps with people from Planned Parenthood, to ensure that this program is never adopted. So your problem will remain exactly the same, to determine the real issue and decide your position about it. All right, suppose your position is sexual activity outside of marriage is wrong. What's the antithesis, the opposite of this particular idea? Now, toward what synthesis will the facilitator likely try to move the group or community before any mention of this sex education program to be launched at your school? The desired compromise position will probably go something like this. Since teen sexual activity is unavoidable, youngsters who indulge must do so as safely as possible without consequences and without hurting anybody else. Once the provocateur can get everyone in the group to agree to this position, then she can go about garnering support for anything, from AIDS posters for kindergartners to condoms for first graders. It doesn't matter. Anyone who balks will be reminded about the group consensus over and over and over again until most people behave themselves. Some will actually believe the consensus makes sense. Nobody will want to appear stuffy or out of it with the rest of the group, even though most members may have held the same position or thesis you did when they walked in the room. Notice that the counterculture never compromises. This is one of the tell-all giveaways that you're dealing with a pro. For example, if the topic is the environment, you'll never hear a word about global warming being just one theory. If the topic is vouchers or tuition tax credits, you'll never hear a word from the facilitator about working together with homeschoolers. Consensus in the context we're discussing it is always a one-way street. Traditionalists like you will do all the compromising, meaning you'll be railroaded into giving in. The key to the facilitator's success, then, is controlling the environment of thought, holding on to the reins of the discussion. Your task is not to let that happen. Not at the beginning, not an hour later, not ever. So, how do you control psychological manipulation? Using just the right combination of marketing and agitation results in the ability to manipulate people. If done properly, one can fool most of the people most of the time. Psychological manipulation relies on 4 key maneuvers. The aim is to legitimize, then institutionalize unpopular and bogus policies before people know what hit them. The resulting marketing package is not a one-size-fits-all. Rather, different packages are targeted to different elements of society: the business community, the intelligentsia, religious leaders, lawmakers. Take redefining terms. The public misinterprets the terms modifying behavior, targeting attitudes, and outcomes. They think those are good-sounding words. Most of the public assumes that behavior means conduct, that attitude means temperament, that outcomes mean standards. Not so. In the jargon of psychology, modifying behavior means altering beliefs. Attitude means viewpoints. and outcomes means the worldviews a child is supposed to leave school with. A person's attitudes taken together compromise his belief system. People typically are unaware of their belief system as it's made up of unconscious automatic responses to life situations. So the first step in engineering a widespread change of viewpoint is simply to redefine the terms and to ensure that the new terminology feels good. Slogans help to redefine terms. Appealing marketing slogans like smart growth, critical thinking, urban sprawl are coined by ad agencies paid by special interests to promote and disseminate deceptive buzz terms to various target audiences such as business leaders, and to slap those labels on everything that stands still. The same packaging, the same package technique is modified slightly to market ideas to children. How did Britney Spears and Eminem manage to become popular among 8-year-olds who are typically not yet sexually aware? By targeting a market. Targeting a market or proper packaging of a product helps ensure that it can be sold to and accepted by virtually any audience. Just as entertainers who look like prostitutes and pimps and drug addicts are sold to little children, politically charged curriculums are marketed to youngsters in the classroom too, as Michael Chapman showed you so well a few minutes ago. To do it, the advertisers, who in this case are called curriculum developers, must poll, test, and survey the target subjects. That's those polling questions that your kids got that Michael Chapman showed you, to find out what makes them tick. Then they know how to appeal to their audience or market. Wrong-headed legislation emerges from the fact that policymakers are convinced by professional manipulators that the majority of citizens, or at least the big political contributors, actually favor such initiatives as environmental extremism or graphic sex education. Paid provocateurs representing vested interests generate the phony consensus at deceptive lay meetings that dupe the community members into believing they will have input into the decision-making process when in fact the outcome is already assured. Pupils in the classroom are similarly duped via activities, discussion groups, tests, phony tests, surveys, and curriculum materials designed not to teach but to deceive by appealing to the children's egos, by making them believe their gut reactions are real solutions without reference to any facts or timeless principles. Creating and controlling the psychological environment requires the application of 3 axioms. Repetition. If people hear the same phrases and slogans long enough, they'll come to accept them. They will rarely recall where the ideas originated from. If individuals are isolated, undermined, and embarrassed, and outmaneuvered often enough, they will give up or become so irrational in presenting their views that no one who's not already in their camp will listen. This is also called marginalization and delegitimizing the opposition, but it's in fact isolation. Then there's labeling. If negative labels are applied consistently, both subtly and blatantly, to certain actions such as faith in God, and certain individuals and organizations, say Promise Keepers or just fill in the blank, whatever organization you wish, they can, by their very mention, function as negative conditioned responses. Commit these 3 tenets to memory: repetition, isolation, and labeling. Their successful application produces a populace that values expediency and group approval over independent thought and knocks out all considerations of right or wrong. The target population will actually work to avoid any appearance of individualism for fear of being seen a maverick in the eyes of the group. This goes a long way in quashing dissent. The goal of life becomes to hide in a social group and to allow organizational leaders to make the tough decisions. Framing the debate is key to climate control. That's what I call it. That is, keeping control of the psychological environment. When you frame the debate, you direct or drive the discussion. That is, you deflect attention from what the real agenda is. In effect, you tell people what they're going to think about and for how long. Now, I want to focus your attention on the classroom setting for just a moment, because raw indoctrination, which is used in the classroom, entails to a large extent framing the debate just like it's used with adults. Just as in the media, they tend to dictate what Americans are going to think about and for how long, like with the Michael Jackson thing and years ago the O.J. Simpson business. Students in today's therapy-style classrooms are encouraged to discuss, read, and engage in activities that support a particular worldview. As soon as the pupil deviates from that worldview, the topic or the activity is changed or ended. Now, this, of course, is the opposite of free expression or open discussion, but that's not how it's labeled. It's labeled academic freedom. But indoctrination, like its sister brainwashing, is a more sophisticated form of psychological manipulation. It goes beyond framing the debate because its purpose is not merely to redirect attention or disrupt the thought process, but to systematically root out a person's support system, their emotional support system. This is something that not only you and as an adult must train yourself to recognize and combat, but you must teach your children to do it as well. There are 5 basic steps to indoctrination. You sweep away the subject's support base, that's his or her emotional life raft. Undermining parents is a favorite technique, a way of yanking the rug out from under the kids. Bombard the subject's senses with a steady diet of conflicting, confusing images and words in order to impair rational thought and discourage reflection, that's cognition. The technical term for this is, as I showed you in a previous slide there, was thought disruption. The result is a vacuum where the belief system used to be. Once a vacuum has been created, leaving the subject vulnerable and impressionable, and the technical term is willing to receive stimuli, you leave the subject to the desired ideas, concepts, and beliefs via trained intermediaries, that's facilitators and so forth, the clinicians, change agents, agitators. And then, after that, you condition the subject through repeated exposure to the desired beliefs using a wide variety of formats and activities. You repeat the lies, in other words, until the subject believes them. Then you test, survey, or analyze the market figures to ascertain whether the new beliefs have been internalized, as they call it, and accepted. If not, you recycle the subject. You go through the whole thing again. Indoctrination depends on the intermediary, say a teacher trained as a change agent, appearing value neutral even though the materials and the agenda are not. Thus does the new breed of teacher, also called a coach clinician or facilitator, avoid lectures, rote drills, workbooks, because instruction, as per the technical definition you and I grew up with, isn't desired anymore. Knowledge imparted in a systematic manner is not the point of the exercise. Rather, the idea is to interpose, smuggle in, as it were, certain impressions, notions, attitudes, judgments, and conclusions into that vacuum created by stripping the belief system and impairing rational thought. In this way, viewpoints that might have been rejected by the subject out of hand will suddenly appear plausible. This means the target population must experience repeated exposure to the same desirable beliefs, using a wide variety of formats and activities. Let's take the acceptance of homosexuality. Now, this can be promoted, is promoted, in a variety of ways. For example, 1, by offering a new Barbie doll spin-off called the Gay Billy doll. You may have seen it. Another way is to working with producers to ensure that a wide variety of popular TV programs have gay and lesbian actors and plot lines, or handing out pro-homosexual literature to youngsters as they enter or leave elementary schools, or just keeping the topic of homosexuality always in the news with sympathetic articles in magazines, gay marriage, hate crimes, gay parades, and so on. And then there's launching non-stop ads and billboard campaigns, usually under the cover of AIDS awareness. In a school setting, conditioning would entail an interdisciplinary approach to learning so that the topic is inserted into all curricular areas, like Michael Chapman showed you in the fuzzy math thing. You put it in, you intersperse it everywhere you possibly can. You slap the message on everything that stands still. The same approach is applied to promote gun control, global warming theory, or smart growth. Same thing. One reason our side has fared so poorly is that we have failed to utilize the multidisciplinary approach to advancing our views. In Washington, D.C., where I am, for example, we have no billboards on the highway or in the subway stations like our opposition does. In Hollywood, there's little effort to recruit good script writers and lobby producers, even though there are some there that would be ripe for the lobbying if you were to do so. In Detroit, no one is at the elementary schools checking for people illicitly handing out gay literature. In New York, there's no massive effort to buy up or to take over existing media outlets, even though you could do so. When we do form new media outlets, we label ourselves conservatives or religious, so that our opposition doesn't have to do it for us. They never call themselves the leftist television network. Okay, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. The final phase of indoctrination is always testing. And there's a little spin on that. To be sure the desirable new ideas and beliefs are internalized and accepted by the public. In the case of, say, homosexual tolerance or even just sexual freedom, promiscuity, for example, experts would look at the sales figures for the gay Billy dolls. That's a test. And that Austin Powers doll that squawks, "Are you horny, baby?" at the child who picks it up off the shelf. The sales figures function as a test. If the test results are disappointing, it's time to recycle, usually using a more hard-hitting approach and going through the whole 5-step indoctrination process again. Eventually, resistance to sex-filled entertainment starts to sound silly. If the Austin Powers doll that squawks, "Are you horny, baby?" is deemed funny by most parents instead of gross, then that's success. The reason the method works is that various marketing campaigns or lessons, if you will, bypass the conscious intellectual mind and shoot directly for the more vulnerable subconscious. It goes right for the gut. So how do you help kids avoid groupthink? Not only do you have to deal in meetings and on committees and, with these specific attack strategies used against you by professional manipulators, you have to teach your children the pitfalls of misleading rhetoric. That is, you have to explain, and frequently, how words can be put together to deceive them. In this age of Oprah, for example, you'll have to explain what privacy means. They don't know. I mean, it used to be that if someone came into your house and asked, "How much did you pay for your couch?" that would have been insulting. You'd have thought that was private. Not anymore. The child cannot possibly be expected to know what's inappropriate if you don't explain it to him. So, at the beginning of this session, I alluded to the principles of psych war. The most fundamental precept, which again goes all the way back to the days of Confucius, is all warfare is based on deception. This means every kind of war, not just some wars. Thus we see that as early as 500 BC, philosophers understood that success in war, be it armed or psychological, depends on the ability to confuse and delude while concealing one's true character, weaknesses, strong points, and intentions. Let me say right up front here, this is not lying as in bearing false witness against one's neighbor. This refers to your personal demeanor, the way you conduct yourself, not to something that you state or write down about somebody else. For example, always let your opponent believe that an escape route is open, so they will flee, showing that there's a road to safety, an alternative to losing all, then strike. That's from that little book, The Art of War. Let's consider this allusion to an escape route here. Our opponents have always given us an escape route. What do we escape to? Legitimacy, acceptance. What's the price? Capitulation on the issues that are more important to our adversaries. The road to safety is usually enticing bait that will distract you from the larger issue that is important to your opposition. The Democrats used the phony budget agreement in 1999, which allowed Republicans to save face with the public by claiming victory. But once they seized this route, they were attacked from another direction. An enemy may be conquered more easily if the appropriate conditions have been created. What are the conditions? People, what are the conditions that you create? Framing the debate and controlling the psychological environment. Recruit persons who are highly intelligent but who can appear to be stupid, who may seem to be dull but in reality are strong, who are vigorous and energetic but can appear to weary easily, who are well versed in earthly matters and able to endure great humiliation in order to succeed. This axiom is absolutely crucial to success. You have to learn to play the game, then turn the tables. And I must say that Mrs. Davis is one of the best people I've ever seen to intuitively understand this principle in talking to her. It's obvious that she understands this requirement. But, you know, all of us have to do that. And the other thing we have to do is not to gobble preferred baits. Our opposition throws us a bone every once in a while on some favorite issue, and in the process saps our energy and diverts our attention from still other issues. Too often we take the bait without a quibble. For example, the bait of environmental conservation, as Michael Shaw pointed out in the first presentation. Weary your opponents by keeping them constantly occupied. Make them rush about, offering them ostensible advantages. How many times does this have to happen to us before we get the message? Our adversaries have taken our strengths, such as time-tested moral virtues, and made them into weaknesses, something everyone's supposed to laugh at on TV, while utilizing our weaknesses in organizational know-how and strategy against us. The conservation issue is a perfect example. We're kept so occupied with the rights of bugs and fish that we've nearly forgotten about the rights of humans. So get it into your heads that our enemies don't care about such things as unborn children or the safety of animals and mothers, one way or the other. But if the issue keeps us busy, that's often good news for them. If you don't believe it, go back and study the chronology of the environmental debate and, say, the abortion debate, and then juxtapose the various wins and losses we have had on other issues around the same time in the House and Senate. Another example is race. We're so constantly confronted with articles and news concerning racial tensions that hardly anybody remembers the dream of a colorblind, melting pot society. Those skilled at making an opponent move do so by creating some situation to which he must conform. For example, by enticing him with something he's sure to take. That's sort of like not taking the bait, but not exactly. This is what the opposition has done with declining test scores. By creating a situation in which academic scores are sure to decline, and Michael Chapman explained how that was done, of course the scores in math, hard math, science, and so on are going to decline. Then we were enticed to take the bait of school reform and standards. From there, it's a short jump to restructuring schools, ostensibly to improve test results. Unfortunately, both the standards and the reform have been largely bogus, the terms redefined. Now, here's a good one. Do not demand accomplishment of those who have no talent. I almost hesitated to add this one, but hey, Sun Tzu put it in there, 500 BC. Now, I know that sounds laughable and obvious, but it's not. For example, most staff advisors on education for members of Congress have no particular expertise in that field, or for that matter, any knowledge concerning the major players' invested interests in education. Worse, the position tends to be viewed by them as a stepping stone for political science majors barely out of college onto something a little more exciting. Many such staffers are the sons and daughters of important somebodies in government, and they're not exactly what you'd call quick studies. The extent of the staffer's knowledge about education is something along the lines of John Dewey being a saint who modernized the schools. Think progressive education. And that the leftist extremist lobbying union, the National Education Association, actually looks out for teachers and kids. By the way, who can tell me, this is a test, I'm an old school teacher so I have to do this, who can tell me what psych war rule that we've gone over the expression progressive education comes under. Yes? What is progressive education? What expression does that, what is that? It's a slogan. Remember? Slogans. And so that helps them. By the way, let's see, most experienced and talented persons should hold these positions on staff research advisory positions. We should be paying them big bucks, even if it's a low-profile position, because that tells them that it's valued even though it's low profile. Our adversaries, our opponents have always known this, and that's why they have held the advantage. They pay their staff advisors big bucks. Those skilled in war bring the opponent to the field at battle. They do not allow themselves to be taken or drawn there. Why do we always wind up debating issues on our adversary's turf? When we go to meetings, it's at a time and place of the opposition's choosing. For example, when we debate in a public forum, it's frequently the big 3 TV networks that get us there. And then guess whose agenda gets the positive coverage? The media hype, of course, is the bait, and we take it. What would happen, for example, if we invited our enviro extremists and smart growth adversaries to debate our side right here today on this turf? They'd just blow us off. Disrupt the opponent's alliances using deceptive operations. Be seen in the west and march out of the east, lure your enemy to the north and strike in the south. Drive the opposition leaders crazy, he repeats it again, bewilder them so that their constituencies disperse in confusion. We've already talked about how the counterculture left drives us crazy with its double standards and hypocrisy. What we haven't discussed is the element of surprise, luring one's enemy to the north and striking in the south. This means using that element of surprise, for example, by appearing to capitulate on some issues when really buying time to snatch a bigger prize. School privatization schemes like charter schools and vouchers, for example, will in the long run inject additional federal dollars into the school systems, along with the leftist strings that no doubt will be attached. But while we're taking this bait, more red tape and bureaucratic nonsense is piled on to the process of launching a private school, thus driving up the prices. In other words, the left throws us a bone to deflect attention from what they're really up to. Numbers alone confer little advantage. Our opposition has been masters of the numbers game, selecting the time and places for confrontation, packing audiences and committees, so they can count on their numbers being greater than ours. But, you know, looking around this room, yeah, true, we don't have a lot of people, but, you know, Jesus understood the principle of this principle better than our opposition does. He had only 12 disciples, and they changed the whole world. Avoid the opposition when his spirit is keen, and attack him when it's sluggish. This is control of the morale factor. Why do you suppose most school-related meetings are held in the evenings? And it's probably true of the smart growth and all of the others too. True, most people work during the day, but hey, so do the provocateurs. Remember, provocateurs know you'll be more sluggish in the evenings. So rest up. When a faction's leaders or policies are inconsistent, one can bet that spirits are low and the rank and file angry. When people belonging to a faction continually gather in small groups and whisper, the leaders have lost confidence in their constituents. Isn't this amazing? 500 BC. Our adversaries are ever looking for signs of dissension and confusion in our ranks. So care must be taken to avoid showing inconsistency, because friction receives huge play in the liberal-dominated press and is used against us. Okay, the way in which the mind goes about drawing conclusions is based upon established patterns of logic. This is important if you want to avoid falling victim to thought disruption, which we talked about earlier. Thought disruption is the inability to sustain a line of reasoning from beginning to conclusion. Sometimes the cause is continuous interruptions. The interruptions built into the typical school day have played a huge part in children's inability to concentrate. Later, this is taken for maladies like attention deficit disorder. The only deficit is the one the schools are creating by cutting out the learning time. But there's another cause for thought disruption. Most people argue in such a way as to make their case appear more strong than it really is. Thought disruption distracts the listener, and eventually we may forget what we're even talking about. And that's why I said, remember your position on an issue. Now, this issue comprises a large part of my 5 to 8 hour course. Among the methods of distracting participants in a meeting and or deceptively augmenting one's positions are leaving out part of a quotation, misquoting somebody, dismissing the alternatives, changing the subject, that's a favorite, exaggerating the facts, appealing to popularity, or smearing the opponents. Lay audiences today are not expected to be able to pick up on faulty reasoning as long as it's smuggled in. A fallacy of logic is a deceptive maneuver intended to bolster an argument. There are, of course, many fallacies, and the ones I focus on in my seminars are the ones parents and other citizens are most likely to encounter on a rigged task force or some kind of committee. And these are some of them that you will see. I'm not going to go into each one because we don't have time, but that's the kind of thing that I focus on in the longer, it's in my manual in the back, and I do say quite a bit on it there. But you need to keep in mind that this is the way they bolster an argument many times. Give you a chance to look at that for just a second. There are other techniques too, such as the Tavistock and Alinsky techniques, which again I don't have time to go into. Then there's the dead giveaway phrases that should signal you that you're dealing with a professional. They always start something with a particular lead-in, and I list those lead-in phrases that as soon as you hear that, a red flag should go up in your head that you're dealing with a pro. But for now, let's summarize the basics of what I've covered here. Know when you're under attack. If you can't spot verbal aggression when you hear it, you'll be a perfect target. Do not assume you're oversensitive, paranoid, reactionary, narrow, or that you just don't get it. If something doesn't sound right, there's probably a reason. Know what kind of attack is being employed against you, and that goes back to that list that I just gave you. Learn to identify some of the basic structures of fallacious reasoning. Learn to gauge the skill of your adversary and other participants. Make your defense appropriate to the attack. Remember that a stock response is not necessarily the right one to use. Frequently, the best defense is a good offense. I'll say almost always the best defense is a good offense. When targeted, always question the opponent's basic assumptions rather than taking the bait. Nail him right there. And finally, play through, follow through, play to win. Don't feel guilty about fighting back. Political indoctrination or American constitutionalist? UN's international human rights or the U.S.'s inalienable rights? Private property does not lead to tyranny. Government control of property does. You play to win. You keep those thoughts in your mind when you're at these meetings, and remember to follow through on that and never let it go. Thank you very much.